In week 4 of the course, we talk about victimology theories of crime. Can you perhaps give a quick summary of some of the key theories?
Okay. So victimology as a science was first proposed in the 1940s. The early writers were a person called von Hentig and Mendelssohn. The focus of their activity actually today is very much the subject of criticism. Each of them took a different perspective about the role that the victim played in bringing about their own demise. Mendelssohn, for example, talked about the victim's culpability. Von Hentig looked at what it was that the victim did that caused them to become a victim of crime. Each tried to encapsulate their theory into topologies. Mendelssohn in particular, his theory was taken up by people like Marvin Wolfgang, who did a study on homicides, and he determined that using the theoretical perspective as proposed by Mendelssohn, that there were some people who were victims of homicides who actually actively contributed to becoming a victim. And at the other extreme, there were people who were completely innocent. That notion of precipitating, or even in law we would say provoking your own victimisation, was maintained as a consistent area of inquiry by the early victimologists. And in fact, Meyer in the 1970s did a study on victims of sexual assault and pointed out that anything up to 1/4 of women who were raped in fact actively contributed. Now, it was that study in particular that brought out the strongest critique of this notion of victim blaming and the idea that victims could precipitate their own victimisation. In fact, Asap Fatah, one of the leading writers who took some of that early work and expanded on it in his theories, he made a clear distinction between the notion of provocation, which is a legal concept, and precipitation. And one of the issues that he raised about precipitation was that it was in fact a useful term for us to be able to understand why crime happens. And that if we want a richer and fuller understanding of why crime happens, then we need to understand, for example, if you've got a coin, both sides of the coin. You need to not only understand the criminal aspect, but as Mendelssohn called it, the victimal aspect as well. And statistically, some of the research that was done in the late 1960s shows that both in a micro as well as a macro environment, there are common environmental factors as well as individual characteristics that are shared between victims and offenders. The theories that evolved thereafter are often called lifestyle theories, and they focus on, again, the circumstances within which a person is victimised, whether it be the choice with respect to lifestyle. So here, for instance, in Australia, we tend to have a high level of assaults that happen in public places compared to some other countries in the world. Well, one of the reasons for that is that we have an environment, whether in a climatic sense, as well as in a social sense, that provides opportunities for people to be out using public space for much of the year. And we also have fairly liberal hours of trading with alcohol and the like. And so this mix of all of these factors in terms of lifestyle choices that we make actually creates the circumstances within which victimisation can happen. And that's not to say that it should happen, it shouldn't happen, but that it's just from a purely empirical perspective that those lifestyle factors can have some influence. More recently, we've seen some greater focus on what are called victim-centric theories of victimology. So some of those early theories were in a criminological context, then in a lifestyle context were still very much in the criminal justice type sphere. But more recently, we've seen an attempt to try and clearly separate victimology from being seen as a subset of criminology. And some of those theories include, for example, psychosocial coping theory, which suggests, among other things, that the life experiences we have, the sort of collection of all different factors, whether it be learnt or experienced, that actually influence the way we react to victimisation, no matter what the victimisation is, how we react to it and how victimisation affects people. So the focus of that theory is victim-centric, putting yourself in a position of a victim and looking out, and less focused on the actual cause of the victimisation in the first place. And we've seen some other theories that have evolved as well that are essentially trying to say, let's take the original idea that Mendelssohn put forward to develop a science that focused exclusively on the victim, but let's make it focused on the victim. One of the difficulties, however, that's been dominant in the discussion about whether victimology is even a social science of its own standing is the fact that it's unclear what is the scope of that science. Is it just criminal victimisation? Is it human rights? Or is it a very global? If you think about the sources of victimisation, you can divide them in broad terms between natural interventions such as natural disasters, predatory animals or disease, and on the other hand human interventions, of which some of those interventions we describe as criminal. Others, as some of the feminist writers, they talk about patriarchy, which is very much a structural form of victimisation. In our own law, we talk about civil as well as criminal law. And then we also have things such as suicide, which is a form of what some people call auto-victimisation or self-victimisation. So where do you pitch victimology as a social science? And because we haven't settled what the actual scope is, it's very hard to argue what victimology is in terms of a science or a humanity area of investigation, and also to distinguish what actually are the underlying theories that underpin that body of knowledge.